Hello friends, and welcome to the Cold War Prepper. Today I'm going to be a little bit, my wife said she heard it, and when I was tried to record and it didn't record, a little bit edgy on the political side. But really that's not my intention to be political. My intention is to give you history and facts and let you be the judge, because I think our schools are letting us down. They're not teaching civics. They're not teaching the history of things the way they should be. I think that some of the Supreme Court decisions even have us afraid to teach the history of religion because they're afraid that that was going to violate the establishment clause. But what I would like to do is I'd like to take the First Amendment, one particular, and by the way, this is a video response to Dan Hart's article in Sports Illustrated on June 15th, and who says that if the Supreme Court hears the Kennedy case that is currently before us and overturns prior precedent, that it's going to be a threat to democracy. So there's a couple things there. Number one is challenging his definition of democracy, and number two is an overturning of those 6 prior cases really a threat to anything. So let's start off with the First Amendment and take one particular phrase out of there, 2 phrases actually, 2 subjunctive clauses. And it says, Congress shall make no laws regarding the establishment of a religion, comma, nor restrict the free exercise thereof. So there's 2 things it cannot do. It can't establish a religion. It can't restrict your practice of religion. So let's look in the dictionary and say, what is the definition of establish? And it's a transitive verb. It means to cause an institution, for example, to come into existence or begin operating, to find or to found or to set up. Number 2, to bring about, generate, or effect. And number 3, to place or settle in a secure position or condition. Now let's talk about restrict the free exercise. So what does restrict mean? It's also a transitive verb, and it means to keep or confine within physical limits, to prevent or prohibit beyond a certain limit or by restriction, and or to restrain within bounds, to limit or confine. So that's what there was. Now at the time that this amendment was being written, we can go back and find out that Thomas Jefferson, who was a big proponent, was communicating with Bishop William Warburton, and so they had this concept. Remember, we were just breaking free from the Church of England, and so he said, what constitutes establishing a religion? So what Thomas Jefferson was thinking about was, number 1, that religion is then fully funded by the state, like the Church of England. They collect your tithe through their income tax system or tithing system and then dispense it out to the church, whether you're a member of the church or not. Number 2, the church had representation in the legislature. So the Archbishop of Canterbury has a seat in Parliament. We don't do that here in the U.S. No, there's no religion that has, there's no seat established. It's either you're a representative of the people in the House of Representatives or you're a representative of the state originally in the Senate. And now that was overturned by the 17th Amendment, so both of them are now representatives of the people, and we've lost our federal idea of government by not having any representation by the states. So the third thing they could do is they could try citizens for heresy. So the U.S. government could try you for heresy if you violated the church that the precepts of the church that they've established. Number 4, that the state would determine who is ordained, who serves as a priest, a bishop, an archbishop, etc., etc. Number 5, the government would preside over all church councils to approve modifications to church doctrine. And number 6, the government has the final say in who would be excommunicated. So quite a list. That's what they were thinking at the time that they passed the First Amendment, and that's what they did not want to happen. So that was their definition of establish, which is quite different from the modern interpretations by the liberal Supreme Courts. So let's go back into a little bit of history of religion. Remember that in 419 AD, the Bible was canonized, and that is at the Council of Rome, they determined which books were put into the Bible and all that kinds of stuff. And that remained that way until right at 1517. So roughly 1100 years, the Bible was one set of books. And in 1517, Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, and nailed it to the door of the church. He was an Augustinian monk, by the way. And so the church asked him to renounce his 95 Thesis. He refused, so 4 years later in 1521, he was excommunicated and formed the Lutheran Church. Well, one of his precepts in that 95 Thesis was what's called sola fide, or by faith alone, that man is saved by faith alone and there's nothing else. You don't have to do any good works, don't have to do anything else. And so in order to do that, he did two things. Number one, he changed one verse in Scripture so that it says, for it is by faith alone that man is saved and not by works. And the original translation says, for it is by faith that man is saved. It doesn't say faith alone. The only place it says faith alone is in James, where it says, you're not saved by faith alone. So that's the reason why he also threw out 4 books in the New Testament, because they didn't support his sola fide definition. That was James, Jude, Revelation, and Hebrews. He also threw out 6 books of the Old Testament, which are called the Apocrypha. Those were 6 books written in Greek that he said didn't match the Hebrew Old Testament, so he threw those out. Now, the reason they were included in the Council of 419 was because they were thrown out in 100 AD by the Jews, but during the time of Christ, they were in the writings that were worshipped or read by the church, and so therefore it was considered to be part of the Scripture at the time of Jesus, and so that's the reason why it was kept in the Bible at the Council of Rome in 419. Now, in 1530, John Calvin, who was a French-Swiss Protestant revolutionary, broke free, and he formed basically what is called the Protestant Revolution. And from that, John Wesley later formed the Methodist Church, several others. And so what we see happening in 1530 was John Calvin said, wait a minute, Martin Luther, you're wrong. I can understand doing away with the Apocrypha, but we're going to bring back Hebrews, Jude, James, and Revelation. So the Protestant Bible now we have 3 Bibles. The Roman Catholic version from 419, the modified version that was put out by Martin Luther in 1521, and then we have the further modification that gets it back closer to the original Roman Catholic Bible in 1530 by John Calvin. Then in 1531, King Henry VIII asked for a divorce, an annulment, by the Pope, and the Pope said, no, you've had too many divorces already. And so King Henry VIII said, well, then I'll just form my own church. So he broke free of the Roman Catholic Church. So we have all these separations from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1500s. And he formed his own church, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. And guess who was the new head of the Church of England, who could grant himself his own divorces? So that was kind of where that went. And so he, later on, King James would ask for the Bible to be translated from Latin into English, and that's where we get the King James Version, which is basically the version that was done by John Calvin, which doesn't have the Apocrypha, but it does have all the other books that were approved by the Catholics in 419 AD. So, look at all this revolution going on in the world, separating away from the Catholic Church. So there were some groups of people who didn't even believe in the Church of England, so they wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. So you have the Pilgrims, you have the Quakers, you have the Puritans, you have all these different churches breaking away. So in 1620, 35 members of a radical Puritan group known as English Separationist Church left southwestern England, a little port called Port Plymouth, and landed at a place they called Plymouth Rock. And they had illegally broken from the Church of England, so they were being persecuted. So they wanted religious freedom, so they decided to go to this newfound country in North America, and ended up in the Boston area. Then we had the Quakers, better known as the Religious Society of Friends, and so they were in England. They separated from the Church of England. They were beginning to be persecuted, so they went to Holland, where they were once again persecuted. So they left Holland and came to North America, and they tried to establish their church here in the U.S. Now, the Quakers made a mistake. They sent some missionaries into Massachusetts, where the Pilgrims, the Puritans, were, and they had established a law that you could have no other religion other than the Pilgrim Quaker religion. I'm sorry, the Pilgrim Puritan religion. So the Quakers were arrested for missionary work in Boston, and one of them, Mary Fisher, was executed in Boston Common on 1st of June, 1660. Well, that reached the king. And the king said, no, 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 you can't execute people because they have a different religious belief than you. So in 1861, King Charles II prohibited the execution of anyone simply based on the religious difference from where you are. And then later he revoked the Massachusetts Bay Charter and sent over a governor from England appointed by the king to rule over Boston and Massachusetts in general. And then in 1689, they passed the Religious Toleration Act, which basically said you had to tolerate other religions. So that's kind of where we were. And so each state kind of had their own official religion, if you will, or majority rules. So Virginia from 1606 until 1830 was Anglican. New York, I'm not going to give the dates because it goes way too long. New York, the official religion was Anglican. Massachusetts, it was Congregationalist Church, the Puritans. Maryland was the Anglican Church. Now here's a funny thing. Maryland at that time had the greatest concentration of Roman Catholics. Number 5, Delaware did not have one. Number 6, Connecticut, and you've got to remember this because this is going to become important when we talk about Thomas Jefferson. Connecticut's official religion was the Congregational Church, so that was the dominant church, the one that was officially recognized by the state. New Hampshire, the Congregational Church. Rhode Island did not have one. Georgia had no official religion. However, Article 6 of their Constitution says that representatives to the state legislature shall be of the Protestant religion. They didn't want any papists, as they call them, that's Roman Catholic. They didn't want any Mohammedists, and they didn't want any Jews ever elected to the legislature. That's since been overturned. North Carolina was Anglican, South Carolina Anglican, Pennsylvania had no official religion, neither did New Jersey. So the majority of states had the Anglican Church as their state church. That means that you had to tithe, you had to participate de facto in that religion, whether you wanted to or not, even if you were of that religion. So now let's take a look. So that's kind of the climate at the time that we have the revolution in 1776 and the writing of the Constitution. And so the second portion of that article on Sports Illustrated is that overturning these 6 Supreme Court decisions we'll get into later basically is a threat to democracy. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is the first of those laws was Supreme Court decisions was 1948. So if that's the case, if overturning the 1948 Supreme Court decision is a threat to democracy, then why wasn't 1776 until 1948 a threat to democracy? Because that's what we were. We didn't have that limitation until 1948. So let's go back and take a look at what they were thinking at the time that they wrote it. So Thomas Jefferson in the Federalist Papers emphasizes that the essential goal in designing a constitution for a free people is not the use of fine words about rights that amount only to parchment barriers against tyranny, which is in Federalist 47, but instead the design of an internal structure, Federalist 23, that tilts all the outcomes of the political process in favor of freedom, whether it's religious liberty or freedom of speech and press, or the free use of your ability to acquire property. The real protection was provided by federalism, the separation of powers, checks and balances, and the other features of the Constitution system of a republican form of government. These principles themselves relied on public opinion and kept it at arm's length and shaped it and directed it in a way that was friendly to freedom. So basically, if you have pure democracy, then it's mob rule. If 51% of the population says this is what we want, and 49% says no, we don't, which is where we are today, then that 51% by pure democracy can overrule the rights of the others. We see that with some of the kangaroo trials that we have going on today. We won't allow you to present a defense. We won't allow you to have representation. We're going to do this, and we're going to televise this on TV so that people only see one side of this. And then we're going to allow them to decide based on the facts we provide them. Madison warned that it's certain that if the unrestrained power of the majority rule falls into the hands of a single-minded group without any need for it to compromise with others, neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control of the majority's behavior, Federalist 10. This recognition that morality and religion need the help of wisely formed institutions is coupled with a faith that if we do wisely design our politics, the good sense and sound morality of most people, grounded in their religious upbringing, will be the bedrock on which our constitutional order and our liberties rest. So basically what they're saying there is that people who are well-founded in a moral system are going to be better leaders than those who are not. And it was assumed back in those days that everybody was well-founded in a moral, especially those who would be elected in a moral code of some sort. So now let's move to 1802, 1801, 1802. So in 1801, remember the Connecticut official religion was the Congregational Church, okay? So there was this First Baptist Church in Danbury, Connecticut, and they felt that the Congregational Church was persecuting them because they had to contribute to the Congregational Church, whether they believed in it or not. They had to live under its precepts and all these other kinds of things. So they wrote to Thomas Jefferson, the president at that time, and said, hey, sir, we're being bullied by the Congregational Church here in Connecticut, and we want you to intervene as the federal government and tell them you can't do that. You can't persecute the Baptists. Well, what would happen if the federal government intervened and said, this church has this right and this church does not, cannot, now we're interfering in a distinction between two churches. And that's not what the federal government is for. So remember, we can't establish and we can't restrict. Thomas Jefferson wisely responded to that in 1802, January 1st, and responded to the First Baptist Church in Danbury, Connecticut with this. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, and now he quotes, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof, end quote, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those statements, which tend to restore to man all of his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. So basically, the separation of church and state, what it is the First Baptist Church asked the federal government to intervene and take action against the Congregational Church, and President Jefferson says, I can't. The Constitution prohibits me from putting one church over the other in Connecticut, and you're both free to exercise that. So what I will do, however, is see if I can't make sure that the state honors the First Amendment. And so, ask them to revisit the First Amendment where it says you can't establish a religion and you can't restrict another religion. So that's kind of where we are. So that has nothing to do with can't have religion in politics and can't have politics in religion. Remember, even the Virginia Constitution was written in a church. If we look back, marriage licenses were basically written in the family Bible until 1667. I forget the town, but it was a town in Kansas. It was the first one after the Civil War to issue a marriage license, and they did it because they wanted to prohibit interracial marriage. So you had to apply to the state, or at least to the city, to get a marriage license. So that took marriage out of the religious and put it into the state. So that's not a separation of church and state. Most orphanages up until the mid-20th century were run by religious institutions. I grew up thinking of Father Flanagan's Boys Town in Iowa. The Catholic Church was one of the biggest homes for orphanages in the United States, and then all of a sudden the government took over what religion had been doing. So if we're seeing an encroachment, what we're seeing is an encroachment of the government on behalf of religion. So going back to those marriage licenses, you're married in the, I'm sorry, it's a gnat. Your religion married you. But now, because religion says that you can't have same-gender marriages, and you can't have, all these other types of marriages, the state has taken over defining what marriage is, and the state now does marriage, just like back in 1867. The other thing is, they found out that by issuing marriage licenses, it was a source of revenue. They could charge you $5 and make a profit for registering your marriage. So what they've done is they've taken a lot of the religious realm and put it under the state realm. Where's that separation of church and state? So let's take a look at the Supreme Court rulings, and that are going to be possibly overturned. I don't know which ones. 1948 McCallum versus Board of Education, District 71, that said that if a church rents a gymnasium of a public school and conducts their services in it, that establishes a religion. Now go back to the definition of establish and see if you agree with that. In 1962, Ingo v. Vitale, saying a prayer aloud violates the Establishment Clause. So if you say a prayer aloud, you've established a state religion, and people have to tithe to it. They have to attend your services. The government's going to say who the archbishop is and all these other kinds of things, right? No. 1963, Abington School District versus Schimpf, that state-sponsored devotional Bible studies violate the Establishment Clause. That one I can kind of understand, because remember, now we have three versions of the Bible. We have the original version, which was passed in 419 AD. We have the Lutheran version, that Martin Luther threw out 10 books of the Bible. And then we have the Protestant edition, which John Calvin brought back 4 books that Martin Luther had thrown out. But they still don't have the 6 books of the Apocrypha. So if you choose one of those books for your state-sponsored religious study of the Bible, then are you, in fact, choosing one religion over another? So I can understand a little bit around that prohibition. 1985, we have Wallace versus Jeffrey, that says that even if you have a period of silence, if you stand, hold your hands together, bow your head, have a period of silence, that establishes a religion. Then in 1992, Lee versus Weissman, you can't say an opening and closing benediction at a high school graduation. That establishes a state religion. And then in 1995, they said that you cannot pray before a football game, because that establishes a state religion. I think we need to go back to the original definition of establish. I think we need to go back to the common sense definition of establish, because what we're doing is, with all these, quote, establishment clause renditions of the Supreme Court, we are dishonoring the second part of that, the second clause, which says, nor restrict the free exercise thereof. It seems to me that a person kneeling on a 50-yard line and saying a prayer doesn't establish a religion, but it does support the free exercise, his free exercise of his religion at that point in time. So that's just the way I believe. And that's kind of a short subject of history and religion and the Constitution. Thanks for watching. Y'all have a blessed day. Remember, we're all in this together, so we can get about the other side together. Take care. Bye-bye.